The glass shattered against the stone floor, before Alira Voss even understood why it had been thrown at her feet. "Watch where you stand, empty one," sneered Petra Lang, stepping over the broken shards, as if Alira were nothing more than another obstacle in her path. The great hall of the Voss estate fell into low laughter, the kind that curled around Alira's ears like smoke, thick and impossible to escape. She did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only fed them. Alira bent down, gathered the broken pieces of glass with careful fingers, and said nothing. Around her, the other young wolves of the pack continued their evening meal, pretending not to watch even as their eyes tracked her every movement. She was used to being watched. She was not used to being seen. At 22 years old, Alira had never shifted. Not once. Not as a child playing in the moonlit fields behind her family's home. Not as a teenager during her awakening night, when every other wolf in her generation had transformed beneath the full moon, in a ceremony meant to mark their entrance into adulthood. She had stood in that circle of pale light, surrounded by her cousins and packmates, and felt nothing stir inside her. No claws, no fur, no wolf. Just silence. Her father, Doran Voss, had not spoken to her for 3 days after that night. When he finally did, it was only to say that she would bring shame to their bloodline for the rest of her days, and that she should learn to make herself small, quiet, and forgettable. She had tried. For 6 years, she had tried. But tonight was different. Tonight, the entire pack had been summoned to the Great Hall for an announcement that would change everything, though Alira did not yet know it. "Attention," called Garin Ashby, the pack's elder advisor, his voice carrying easily over the murmuring crowd. He stood at the head of the hall, a scroll bearing the royal seal held tightly in his weathered hands. "A message has arrived from the Alpha King himself." The room went still. Even Petra Lang, who had been smirking moments before, turned to face the front with sudden, sharp attention. "King Kael Draven is holding a gathering," Garin announced, unrolling the scroll with ceremonial care. "Every pack in the realm is required to send its unmated wolves of age. The king seeks his true mate, and tradition demands that all packs present their own before him, that the bond might be found wherever it lies." Whispers erupted immediately. Excitement rippled through the younger wolves, like a current through water. To be chosen by the Alpha King was the highest honor any wolf could hope for. It meant power, protection, a place at the center of the kingdom, rather than its edges. Alira felt only dread. She knew what would happen. She would be forced to attend, forced to stand among wolves, who could shift into magnificent forms of fur and claw and moonlight, while she stood as nothing, wolfless, empty, a joke wearing a dress. Her father found her in the corridor after the announcement, his expression unreadable in the dim torchlight. "You will attend," he said, "not as a request. Every wolf of age must be presented, and I will not have it said that House Voss hid its own out of shame." "Then you admit it is shame," Alira said quietly. Doran's jaw tightened. "You will wear something appropriate. You will not embarrass this family further than you already have." He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps echoing down the stone hall like the closing of a door. Alira stood alone, the weight of his words settling over her shoulders like a familiar heavy coat. That night, she sat by her window, watching the moon rise over the dark hills beyond the estate. She had spent countless nights doing exactly this, wondering what it might feel like to answer the moon's call, the way every other wolf did. To feel fur ripple across skin, to feel bones reshape themselves into something powerful and free. She had read every book in the pack library about failed shifts, about wolves born without their second form. Most such wolves did not survive childhood. The ones who did were rare enough to be called broken, or cursed, or worse. She was neither of those things, she told herself. She was simply herself, but being simply herself had never once been enough for anyone around her. Her only comfort came from Wren Ashby, Garin's granddaughter, and the only wolf in the pack who had never once looked at her with pity or disgust. Wren found her that night on the balcony, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the cold. "You heard then," Wren said, settling beside her without invitation. "The whole pack heard. I imagine the whole kingdom will hear about my humiliation soon enough." Wren nudged her shoulder gently. "You don't know that you'll be humiliated. Maybe the king will barely notice you're there." "That would be a mercy," Alira said, and meant it. "Or," Wren continued, a small smile tugging at her mouth, Maybe something strange will happen, something no one expects. Alira almost laughed. Almost. The only strange thing that could happen is if I suddenly sprouted a wolf out of nowhere, which we both know isn't going to occur. You never know, Ren said simply, and left it at that. Alira did not sleep well that night. She dreamed, as she often did, of running through a forest on 4 legs, wind streaming through fur she did not have, the world blurring past in shapes and scents too vivid for a girl who had never once felt her body change. She woke before dawn with tears on her face, and no memory of why. The days that followed passed in a blur of preparation. Seamstresses were called to fit Alira into a gown suitable for the gathering, though she suspected the true purpose was simply to make her presentable enough that House Voss would not be further embarrassed. She stood still for hours as fabric was pinned and adjusted around her, staring at her own reflection in the mirror, and barely recognizing the girl looking back. She looked, she thought, like someone worth noticing. It was strange, given how invisible she felt inside. Petra Lang made a point of visiting the fitting room twice, each time offering some comment dressed up as concern. It's kind of them to still bring you along, she said the second time, examining her own nails with practiced boredom. Even though we all know how it will go. The king's wolf will sense every other wolf in that hall, and when it comes to you, it will sense nothing at all. I do wonder what that will look like, don't you? Everyone watching him pass you by like you're a piece of furniture. Alira held her tongue, though her hands curled into fists at her sides where no one could see them. You should be careful, Petra, Ren said from the doorway, arms crossed. Careless words tend to come back around. Petra rolled her eyes and left without another word, though not before shooting Alira one last look of pure satisfaction. The morning of departure arrived cold and gray, mist curling low over the estate grounds as carriages were loaded and horses readied. Alira dressed in silence, her maid working quickly and quietly, sensing perhaps that conversation would not be welcome. When she finally looked at herself in the full mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The gown was a deep shade of blue, the color of twilight just before the stars appeared, and it fit her like it had been made for someone entirely different from the girl who usually hid in corners. Doran inspected her briefly before they departed, his eyes moving over her the way one might examine livestock before a sale. It will do, he said finally, which from him was almost a compliment. The journey to the king's territory took 3 full days. Alira spent most of it staring out the carriage window, watching unfamiliar landscapes roll past, mountains and rivers and villages she had never seen before. Ren rode alongside in the same carriage, filling the silence with idle chatter about the gathering, about the king's legendary strength, about the stories that claimed he had never once shown interest in any wolf presented to him, despite dozens of gatherings held over the years. They say his wolf is the most powerful in the realm, Ren said, watching the passing scenery with obvious excitement, that when he shifts, the ground itself seems to shake. Can you imagine standing before something like that? I can imagine standing before it and being completely ignored, Alira replied, though there was less bitterness in her voice now than there had been days before. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion. Perhaps it was something else, some small and stubborn part of her that refused to fully surrender to dread. As the carriage rolled closer to the king's stronghold on the 3rd day, Alira caught her first glimpse of it rising from the mountains ahead, towers of dark stone stretching toward a sky heavy with clouds. It looked less like a castle and more like something carved directly from the mountain itself, ancient and immovable and utterly commanding. Her stomach twisted with a feeling she could not quite name. Fear, certainly, but underneath the fear, something else stirred as well, faint and unfamiliar, like a whisper she could not quite make out. She pressed her hand against the cold glass of the carriage window and watched the stronghold grow larger with every passing mile, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alira Voss felt something other than dread rising within her. She felt, impossibly, a flicker of anticipation. She did not know why. She only knew that whatever waited for her within those dark stone walls, her life was about to change in ways she could not yet imagine. The carriage rolled on through the mist, carrying her steadily toward a fate that had already begun stirring long before she ever knew its name. The gates of the king's stronghold slammed shut behind the last carriage with a sound like thunder, and Alira flinched before she could stop herself. There was no turning back now. Guards in dark armor lined the courtyard, their eyes scanning every arriving wolf with sharp, practiced discipline. Elira stepped down from the carriage on unsteady legs, smoothing the front of her blue gown, as Ren appeared at her side, offering a quick, reassuring squeeze of her hand. "Whatever happens in there," Ren whispered, "you are not alone." Elira wanted to believe her, but the moment they crossed into the great hall, that comfort evaporated like mist under sunlight. The hall was enormous, larger than anything Elira had ever seen, with ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow, and columns of dark stone, carved with the images of wolves in mid-leap. Hundreds of young wolves from packs across the realm stood clustered in groups, dressed in their finest, murmuring nervously among themselves. Many of them, Elira noticed with a familiar twist of her stomach, had wolves standing beside them in human form, their eyes carrying that particular gleam that marked a true shifter, a confidence that came from knowing exactly what they were. She had no such gleam. She never had. "There she is," someone murmured nearby, just loud enough for her to hear. The Voss girl, the one with no wolf. Word, it seemed, had traveled ahead of her. Elira kept her chin lifted and her steps steady, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her falter, though inside, she felt as though the floor might open beneath her at any moment. Ren stayed close, her presence a small shield against the whispers gathering like storm clouds around them. At the front of the hall, upon a raised dais of black stone, sat the throne of the Alpha King, empty for now, flanked by two enormous carved wolves, whose eyes seemed to follow every movement in the room. Elira found herself staring at that empty throne, wondering what kind of man commanded such fear and reverence from an entire kingdom. She did not have to wonder long. A horn sounded from somewhere deep within the stronghold, low and resonant, and the murmuring crowd fell silent almost instantly. Every head turned toward the great doors at the side of the dais, as they swung open with a groan of ancient hinges. Cale Draven entered the hall. Elira had heard countless stories about the Alpha King during the journey here, tales of his strength, his coldness, his refusal to show interest in any wolf, despite years of gatherings, meant to find his mate. None of those stories had prepared her for the reality of him. He moved like something barely contained, powerful in a way that had nothing to do with the size of his shoulders or the sharp line of his jaw, though both were considerable. It was something in his presence, a weight that seemed to press against the air itself, making every wolf in the hall instinctively lower their gaze as he passed. Elira did not lower her gaze fast enough. For one brief moment, as Cale crossed toward his throne, his eyes swept over the assembled crowd, and Elira felt certain, absolutely certain, that his gaze had caught on her for just a heartbeat longer than anyone else. Then he looked away, ascending the dais and settling onto his throne, with the ease of a man who had done this 100 times before, and expected nothing new to come of it. "Let the presentations begin," Garen's counterpart in the king's court announced. A tall advisor named Silas Marrow, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall. One by one, packs stepped forward to present their unmated wolves. Elira watched as young men and women approached the dais, some confident, some visibly nervous, each one waiting to see if the king's own wolf might stir in recognition. Each time, nothing happened. Cale watched with an expression of polite, distant boredom, occasionally nodding at some accomplishment listed by an advisor, but never once showing the flicker of interest that would signal a true bond. The House Voss delegation was called nearly 2 hours later. Elira felt her stomach drop as her father stepped forward first, presenting their family's name and lineage with practiced formality. Then, one by one, the other unmated wolves of House Voss were called forward, including Petra Lang, who moved toward the dais with the confident grace of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for exactly this moment. Petra bowed before the king, and for a moment, Elira almost hoped that something might happen, that Petra's cruelty might finally be rewarded with the one thing she wanted most, if only to end this particular torment sooner. But Cale's expression did not change. He nodded politely, and Petra stepped back into the crowd, her disappointment carefully hidden beneath practiced composure. "Elira Voss," Silas Marrow called next, consulting a scroll in his hands. The hall went quiet in that particular way that told Elira everyone already knew what was coming. Whispers had clearly reached even the king's own court. She stepped forward, her legs feeling distant and strange beneath her, as though they belonged to someone else. The walk toward the dais felt endless, every eye in the hall fixed upon her, waiting, watching, ready to witness her humiliation firsthand. She reached the base of the dais and bowed, exactly as she had been taught, exactly as every wolf before her had done. Elira Voss, Silas read aloud, unmated, 22 years of age, House Voss. There was a pause, the kind of pause that stretched just a moment too long, and Elira understood without needing to be told that Silas was deciding whether to mention what everyone already knew. He cleared his throat and continued reading from the scroll, listing her lineage and accomplishments in the flat, formal tone reserved for such occasions. Elira kept her eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for the polite nod of dismissal that would end this ordeal and let her retreat back into the safety of the crowd. It did not come. Instead, she heard something she had never once heard in the entire history of her life inside the Voss pack. Silence. She risked a glance upward, and what she saw made her breath catch painfully in her throat. Cale Draven was no longer seated on his throne. He stood, his entire body rigid, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made every hair on her arms rise. The advisors around him exchanged startled glances, murmuring quickly among themselves, clearly as confused by this reaction as Elira herself. The rest of the hall had gone utterly still, hundreds of wolves holding their breath, watching their king react to a girl everyone believed to be nothing at all. "Your Majesty?" Silas ventured carefully. Cale did not answer immediately. His gaze remained locked on Elira, something raw and unguarded flickering across his features before he visibly forced it back beneath control. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge that made the entire hall lean in to listen. "Escort Lady Voss to the private chambers," he said. "I wish to speak with her alone." The hall erupted into stunned whispers immediately, hundreds of voices rising all at once, in shock and disbelief. Elira stood frozen at the base of the dais, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it, utterly unable to comprehend what had just occurred. Guards approached her, their expressions carefully neutral, though she caught the surprise in their eyes as well. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes named Callan Doyle, offered her a small, reassuring nod as he gestured for her to follow. Elira glanced back once toward the crowd, searching for Wren, and found her standing frozen in shock alongside everyone else, though a small, hopeful smile had begun to form at the corner of her mouth. As Elira was led away from the hall, she caught one final glimpse of Petra Lang's face, twisted into an expression of pure, undisguised fury, and despite everything, despite the fear and confusion churning inside her, Elira felt something she had not expected to feel at all. A small, fragile spark of hope. Something had happened in that hall, something impossible, and whatever it meant, her life would never again be quite the same as it had been just moments before. The private chamber was smaller than Elira expected, though still grander than any room she had ever stood in. Tall windows lined one wall, looking out over the mountains beyond the stronghold, and a fire crackled in a wide stone hearth, filling the space with warmth that did nothing to settle the storm inside her chest. Callan Doyle left her there with a small bow, closing the heavy door behind him with a soft click that felt, to Elira, like the sealing of her fate. She stood alone for what felt like an eternity, though it could not have been more than a few minutes, her mind racing through every possible explanation for what had just happened. Perhaps the king intended to punish her for some perceived insult. Perhaps this was simply another form of humiliation, crueler and more elaborate than anything Petra Lang could have devised. Perhaps, and this thought frightened her most of all, perhaps something had genuinely gone wrong within her, some hidden defect finally revealing itself, in a way that would mark her as even more strange than before. The door opened again, and Cale Draven entered alone. Elira dropped into an immediate bow, her pulse hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "Your Majesty." "Rise," Cale said, his voice quieter now than it had been in the hall, though no less commanding. "Please." She straightened slowly, forcing herself to meet his eyes, despite every instinct urging her to look away. Up close, he was even more overwhelming than he had appeared from across the hall, tall and broad, with dark hair that fell slightly across his forehead, and eyes the color of storm clouds just before rain. But it was not simply his appearance that unsettled her. It was the way he looked at her, as though he were searching for something he could not quite name. "Do you know why I called you here?" he asked. "No, Your Majesty," Elira admitted. I confess I do not. Cale moved toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the mountains outside for a long moment before he spoke again. When you were presented before me, something happened. Something I have never experienced in my entire life, despite having held gatherings such as this one for nearly a decade. Elira waited, her heart pounding. My wolf reacted to you, Cale continued, turning to face her fully now. Not to your own wolf, as it should react during such presentations, but to something else entirely, something I cannot yet explain. I have no wolf, Your Majesty, Elira said quietly, the familiar shame rising in her chest despite everything. I never shifted. Not once. Not even during my awakening night. I assumed you already knew this, given how the hall reacted to my name. Something shifted in Cale's expression, an intensity that made Elira's breath catch. I am aware of the rumors surrounding your absence of a wolf, but I do not believe they tell the full truth. With respect, Your Majesty, I have lived this truth for 22 years. I think I would know. Cale studied her for a long moment, and Elira had the uncomfortable sensation of being read like an open book, every hidden thought laid bare before him. May I ask you something personal? She hesitated, then nodded, unsure what else to do. Have you ever felt anything, even the smallest sensation, during a full moon? A pull, perhaps. A restlessness beneath your skin that you could not explain. Elira opened her mouth to deny it immediately, the way she had denied it to every healer and elder who had ever asked similar questions throughout her childhood. But something in Cale's steady, patient gaze made the denial die on her tongue. Sometimes, she admitted slowly, the word feeling strange and dangerous in her mouth. There have been nights when I could not sleep, when something inside me felt as though it were straining against a locked door, though nothing ever came of it. I always assumed it was simply my imagination, wishing for something I could never have. Cale's eyes sharpened with sudden interest. And these nights, did they coincide with the full moon? Elira thought back, memory after memory surfacing of restless nights, spent staring at bright moonlight through her window, her skin prickling with a sensation she had never been able to name. Yes, she said slowly. I believe they did. Cale turned away from her again, pacing now toward the fireplace, his expression thoughtful and distant. There is an old legend among the eldest packs, he said finally. A bloodline said to carry wolves so rare, so deeply hidden within their bearers, that they remain dormant for the entirety of a normal life, sleeping rather than absent, waiting rather than missing. Elira's breath caught. You believe I am one of these bloodlines? I do not yet know, Cale admitted, turning back to face her. But I intend to find out, and I would ask that you remain here at the stronghold while I investigate this matter further, rather than returning immediately with your pack. The request stunned her into silence. To remain at the king's stronghold, away from her family, away from the constant judgment of House Voss, felt almost too strange to comprehend, a kindness so foreign she barely knew how to accept it. My father will object, she said finally. Your father, Cale said, a hint of something sharp entering his voice, answers to me, not the other way around. If I request that you remain, he has no grounds to refuse. There was something in the way he said it, a protectiveness that startled Elira, given they had known each other for less than an hour. She studied him carefully, searching for some hidden motive, some cruel twist she had not yet uncovered. But she found nothing except sincerity, and perhaps something else beneath it, something uncertain and searching that mirrored her own confusion. Why does this matter so much to you? She asked finally, unable to hold the question back. You are the Alpha King. You could have any wolf in the realm brought before you, wolves with power and status and perfect bloodlines. Why concern yourself with the wolfless girl from House Voss? Cale was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice had dropped low, almost private, as though the words were meant only for the two of them. Because when my wolf reacted to you in that hall, it was not confusion or curiosity, it was recognition. A recognition I have waited my entire life to feel, and never once experienced, despite years of gatherings meant to find exactly that. Elira's heart stumbled painfully in her chest. You believe I am your mate. I believe, Cale said carefully, that the answer to that question lies somewhere within the mystery of what you truly are, and I intend to uncover it, whatever the cost. The silence between them stretched long and heavy, filled with a tension neither of them seemed willing to name aloud. Alira felt something stirring inside her chest, something unfamiliar and frightening, not entirely unlike the restless sensation she had felt on countless moonlit nights throughout her life. "I will need to consult with the pack elders and the ancient records," Cale continued after a moment, his tone shifting back toward something more formal, though his eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that betrayed the effort it took him to maintain that distance. "In the meantime, you will be given quarters within the stronghold, and a guard for your protection." "Protection from what, Your Majesty?" Cale's expression darkened slightly. "Word of what happened in that hall will spread quickly. There are those within this kingdom who will not welcome the possibility of a hidden bloodline emerging to claim what they believe should belong to wolves of proven status. Jealousy can be a dangerous thing, Lady Voss." Alira thought immediately of Petra Lang's furious expression, as she had been led from the hall, and a small chill ran through her despite the warmth of the fire nearby. "I understand," she said quietly. Cale studied her a moment longer, then moved toward the door, pausing with his hand upon the handle. "For what it is worth," he said, without turning back to face her, "I do not believe the things they have said about you. I have not believed them since the moment I saw you standing in that hall." He left before she could respond, the door closing softly behind him, and Alira stood alone once more in the quiet chamber, her mind spinning with questions she had no answers for. For 22 years, she had been told she was empty, broken, wolfless. For 22 years, she had believed it. But standing there in the firelight, replaying every word Cale Draven had spoken, Alira allowed herself, for the very first time in her life, to wonder if perhaps everyone had been wrong about her all along. Outside the tall windows, the moon had begun to rise over the distant mountains, pale and full and achingly beautiful, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alira did not turn away from it in shame. She watched it climb slowly into the darkening sky, and somewhere deep within her chest, something ancient and long dormant seemed, ever so faintly, to stir and answer. A knife lay flat against Alira's door the next morning, its blade pressed into a folded note that read simply, "Leave before you cause trouble, you cannot survive." Alira stared at it for a long moment, before calling for the guard stationed outside her new quarters, a quiet young man named Finn Harlow who paled the instant he saw what she was holding. "I will inform Captain Doyle immediately," Finn said, taking the note carefully by its edges. "The king will want to know of this at once." "Please," Alira said, though her voice remained steady, despite the unease coiling tight in her stomach. "Let us not make more of this than necessary. It is likely nothing more than someone's poor attempt at frightening me away. With respect, my lady, threats against a potential mate of the king are never nothing." Alira had no response to that. She had not yet grown accustomed to being referred to as a potential mate of anyone, let alone the most powerful wolf in the realm, and the phrase still felt foreign and unearned in her ears. Within the hour, Cale himself arrived at her chambers, his expression carved from cold stone, as he examined the note Finn had delivered to him. Alira watched him read it twice, his jaw tightening with each pass, before he finally set it aside upon a nearby table. "This will not happen again," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable edge of restrained fury. "You cannot promise that," Alira said honestly. "Not unless you intend to guard me every hour of every day." "Then I will do exactly that, if it becomes necessary." He said it so plainly, so without hesitation, that Alira found herself momentarily unable to respond. No one in her entire life had ever offered to protect her so completely, let alone a man she had known for less than a full day. "Who would do this?" she asked instead, setting aside the strange warmth his words had stirred in her chest. "Who benefits from frightening me away?" Cale's expression darkened further. "Many, potentially. There are noble houses within this kingdom who have spent generations positioning their daughters and sons for exactly the moment that occurred yesterday in that hall. The revelation that a hidden bloodline might exist, one capable of claiming what they have long considered rightfully theirs, threatens every ambition they have built their lives around. And you believe one of them sent this? I believe it is possible. I have already asked Captain Doyle to investigate quietly, without drawing further attention to the matter. In the meantime, I would ask that you allow additional guards to accompany you, at least until we understand more clearly what we are dealing with." Alira nodded reluctantly. though the idea of being constantly watched, even for her own protection, sat uneasily alongside a lifetime spent trying to remain unseen. Later that same day, Kale summoned her to a private study deep within the stronghold, where an elderly wolf named Leor Ashwood awaited them both, surrounded by towers of ancient books and scrolls that looked as though they might crumble at the slightest touch. "Lady Voss," Leor said, rising slowly from his seat with the careful movements of great age, "I have heard much about you in a very short span of time. I imagine most of it has been unflattering," Alira said before she could stop herself. Leor's weathered face creased into something that might have been amusement. "On the contrary, what I have heard has been fascinating. Please, sit." Elira settled into a chair across from him, with Kale taking a position near the window, his arms crossed, watching the exchange with careful attention. "Tell me," Leor began, "of the restlessness you feel during the full moon. Describe it to me exactly as you experience it, leaving nothing out, however small it may seem." Elira hesitated only briefly before recounting what she had told Kale the previous evening, adding details she had never before shared with anyone, not even Ren. The strange pressure beneath her skin on moonlit nights, the occasional dreams of running through forests she had never visited, on legs that were not entirely her own, the way her body sometimes ached in the days surrounding the full moon, as though something within her were straining toward a release that never came. Leor listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes upon a piece of parchment, his expression growing increasingly intent as she spoke. "There exists," he said finally, once she had finished, "a bloodline recorded in the oldest texts of our kind, dating back many centuries. It is called in the old tongue, the sleeping line. Wolves born of this bloodline carry within them a second form of such rarity and power that it does not emerge naturally, as it does for the rest of our kind. Instead, it remains dormant, sealed away, waiting for a single specific trigger." "What kind of trigger?" Elira asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "The bond of a true mate," Leor said simply. "According to the old texts, wolves of the sleeping line cannot awaken their own power alone, no matter how many years pass, no matter how deeply they long for it. Only the presence of their true mate, once recognized and accepted, can break the seal holding their wolf dormant." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over all three of them. "You believe this is what I am," Elira said slowly. "I believe it is possible," Leor corrected gently. "The sleeping line has not been confirmed to exist in living memory. Many believed it to be nothing more than legend, a story told to comfort wolfless children throughout the generations. But the reaction King Kale experienced yesterday, combined with the symptoms you have just described, align with every account recorded of this bloodline throughout our history." Elira felt something rise in her chest that she could not quite name, a fragile mixture of hope and fear, so tangled together, she could not separate one from the other. For 22 years, she had been told she was broken. Now an ancient legend suggested she might instead be something rarer than any wolf currently living. "If this is true," Kale said, speaking for the first time since Leor had begun his explanation, "what would be required to confirm it?" "Time, patience, and continued closeness between the two of you," Leor answered. "The bond must be allowed to strengthen naturally. Rushing such a thing, or forcing recognition before it is ready, has historically led to disastrous results in the rare accounts where the sleeping line has been documented." "Disastrous how?" Elira asked, unease creeping back into her voice. Leor's expression grew grave. "In at least 2 recorded instances, forcing the bond before it was ready resulted in the wolf's awakening occurring under conditions of extreme danger or distress, rather than through gentle recognition. The transformation, when finally triggered, was violent and difficult to control, both for the wolf awakening and for those nearby at the time." Elira absorbed this information with a chill settling deep in her bones. The idea that her own awakening, should it ever come, might arrive not through peace but through danger, felt like one more cruel twist in a life already full of them. "Then we proceed carefully," Kale said firmly, his eyes meeting Elira's from across the room. "There is no need to rush anything. We will allow this bond, if it exists, to develop naturally, without pressure or interference." Leor nodded his approval, gathering his notes and scrolls with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades handling precious and fragile things. "I would advise discretion, Your Majesty." If word spreads throughout the kingdom that Lady Voss may carry the sleeping line, I fear the threats she has already received will seem mild by comparison. Discretion has already proven difficult, Cale said grimly, thinking of the knife left upon Alira's door that very morning. But we will do what we can. As they left Lior's study together, walking side by side through the quiet corridors of the stronghold, Alira found herself stealing glances at Cale, trying to reconcile the powerful, distant Alpha King she had heard so many stories about, with the man now walking carefully beside her, clearly concerned for her safety, in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar. "You do not have to protect me," she said finally, breaking the silence between them. "I have survived 22 years without anyone's protection. I imagine I can manage a little longer." Cale stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the dim torchlight of the corridor. "Perhaps you do not need my protection," he said quietly, "but I find that I want to offer it regardless. Is that so difficult to accept?" Alira did not have an answer for that. No one had ever wanted to protect her before, not out of genuine care rather than obligation or duty. She stood there in the quiet corridor, studying the sincerity in Cale's stormy eyes, and felt something shift deep within her chest, something fragile and new and entirely unfamiliar. Perhaps, she thought, this strange new chapter of her life would not be quite as frightening as she had first believed. But somewhere within the stronghold that same evening, in a chamber lit only by candlelight, a young noblewoman named Isolde Crane sat writing a letter of her own, her expression carved from cold, calculating anger, as she sealed the parchment with dark red wax. Whatever Alira Voss truly was, Isolde intended to ensure she never lived long enough to prove it. The horse bolted without warning, screaming as it reared onto its hind legs, nearly throwing Alira from the saddle before she managed to steady herself, with white-knuckled hands gripping the reins. Callan Doyle was at her side within seconds, pulling the panicked animal under control, while shouting orders to the other guards accompanying them through the stronghold's private grounds. Once the horse had settled, trembling but calm, Callan knelt beside its rear leg and pulled free a small, sharp burr that had been wedged deliberately beneath the saddle strap. "This was no accident," he said grimly, holding up the offending object for Alira to see. "Someone placed this here intentionally, knowing full well what it would do once you mounted." Alira's hands shook slightly as she dismounted, though she forced her voice to remain steady. "Another warning, then." "It would seem so, my lady." News of the incident reached Cale within the hour, and Alira watched his expression shift from concern to controlled fury, as Callan explained what had happened. "I want the stables searched immediately," Cale ordered. "Every guard, every servant, every visitor who has had access to the grounds within the past 2 days is to be questioned." "Cale," Alira said quietly, using his given name for the first time since her arrival, the familiarity slipping out before she could stop it. He turned to her immediately, something softening in his expression despite the tension still gripping his shoulders. "Interrogating every servant in the stronghold will only spread fear and suspicion further. Perhaps there is a quieter way to address this." "You could have been seriously injured," Cale said, his voice rough with restrained emotion. "Perhaps worse." "But I was not," Alira said firmly. "And I would rather we handle this with patience than panic." Cale studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his instinct to protect and her clear desire not to be treated as fragile. Finally he nodded, though the tension in his shoulders did not fully ease. "Very well, but you will not ride again without at least 3 guards present, and Captain Doyle will personally inspect every piece of equipment before you use it." Alira did not argue further, recognizing the compromise for the genuine concession it was. That evening, as the sun began setting behind the distant mountains, Cale found Alira sitting alone in the stronghold's private garden, a quiet space of carefully tended flowers and winding stone paths that she had discovered during her first week at the stronghold. She often came here when she needed to think, finding a strange comfort in the solitude that reminded her, oddly, of the isolation she had known her entire life within House Voss, though this isolation felt chosen rather than forced upon her. "May I join you?" Cale asked, pausing at the entrance to the garden. Alira nodded, gesturing to the stone bench beside her, and Cale settled down, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, though not close enough to feel improper. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes before Cale finally spoke. "I wanted to apologize for earlier. I know you do not wish to be treated as though you cannot handle yourself. I appreciate that, Elira said, though I understand your concern comes from a good place. It comes from fear, Cale admitted quietly, surprising her with his honesty. I have waited my entire life to feel what I felt when I first saw you in that hall. The thought of losing you, before we even understand what exists between us, is more frightening than I know how to properly express. Elira turned to study him in the fading evening light, struck once again by the vulnerability he allowed himself to show, only in these private, quiet moments, so different from the commanding presence he projected before his court. Can I ask you something? She said. Anything. Why has it taken so long for you to find your mate? You are the Alpha King. Surely wolves throughout the realm have longed for the honor of standing before you. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the darkening sky above them. I have held countless gatherings over the years, hoping each time that I might finally feel what my father always described feeling, the moment he met my mother. He told me once that the bond announces itself instantly and unmistakably, that there would be no question, no uncertainty, once I found the one meant for me. Year after year, I felt nothing. I began to believe, eventually, that perhaps I was destined to rule alone, that whatever bond my father described simply was not meant for me. And then, Elira prompted softly. And then you walked into that hall, Cale said, turning to meet her eyes directly, wearing a blue gown, standing among wolves who had already shifted and presented their full power before me. And I felt something I have no adequate words to describe. Recognition, certainty, as though some part of me had been waiting my entire life, specifically for that moment, without ever knowing it. Elira's breath caught at the raw sincerity in his voice, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of his words settling comfortably between them in the quiet evening air. I have spent my entire life being told I was less than everyone around me, she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended, less capable, less worthy, less real, somehow, than wolves who could shift and hunt and prove themselves the way tradition demanded. My own father could barely look at me without disappointment clouding his expression. I do not know how to reconcile that history with what you are telling me now. You do not have to reconcile it immediately, Cale said gently, but I hope, in time, you will come to understand that everything you were told about yourself was wrong, not because of some hidden bloodline or ancient legend, but because you are worthy exactly as you are, regardless of what emerges or does not emerge from whatever sleeps within you. Tears gathered unexpectedly in Elira's eyes, and she blinked them back quickly, unaccustomed to such open kindness directed toward her. That is a kind thing to say. It is simply the truth, Cale replied. They sat together as darkness fully settled over the garden, the first stars emerging faintly overhead, and Elira found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, feeling something close to peace. That peace did not last past midnight. She woke suddenly to the sound of her chamber door creaking open, her heart lurching into her throat as a dark shape slipped silently into the room. She sat up immediately, reaching instinctively for the small dagger Callan had insisted she keep beside her bed since the incident with the horse. Do not scream, a low voice hissed from the darkness. I am not here to harm you, only to deliver a message. Elira's hand tightened around the dagger's handle, her eyes straining to make out details in the dim moonlight filtering through her window. The intruder remained cloaked in shadow, deliberately obscuring their features. Speak quickly then, and leave. You do not belong here, the voice said, low and cold. Whatever the king believes he sees in you, it is a mistake that will cost you your life if you do not leave this stronghold before the next full moon rises. This is your final warning. Before Elira could respond, the figure retreated as silently as they had arrived, the door closing softly behind them, leaving her alone in the darkness, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. She did not sleep again that night. Instead, she sat by her window, watching the moon climb slowly across the sky, that same familiar restlessness stirring beneath her skin, stronger now than she had ever felt it before. Whatever slept within her, she thought grimly, watching the pale light bathe the mountains beyond, it seemed increasingly determined to wake, whether the warnings frightened her into leaving or not. She would not run. She had spent her entire life running from judgment, from mockery, from the shame others had forced upon her. She refused to spend whatever remained of it running from fear as well. Come morning, she resolved, she would tell Cale everything, and together, they would face whatever came next. Cale's fist struck the table so hard that the wood cracked beneath the force of it, the sound echoing through the private study like a thunderclap. Someone entered her chambers, he said, his voice dangerously low as he paced before the fireplace. In the middle of the night, past guards stationed specifically to prevent exactly this, and threatened her life directly. And you are telling me we have no leads whatsoever. Callan Doyle stood at rigid attention, his expression grim. The guards on duty reported nothing unusual, Your Majesty. Whoever entered clearly possessed intimate knowledge of the guard rotation and used it to their advantage. This suggests someone within the stronghold itself, someone with access to sensitive information. Elira sat quietly in the corner of the study, watching Cale's controlled fury with a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. She had told him everything over breakfast that morning, watching his expression darken with every detail she provided, and had not expected the raw intensity of his reaction. I want every guard rotation from last night questioned individually, Cale said. I want to know who had access to that information and who might have shared it, deliberately or otherwise. Cale, Elira said quietly, and he stopped his pacing immediately at the sound of her voice. Frightening the entire guard will not necessarily find us answers. Perhaps we should consider who benefits most from my departure, rather than simply who had access to information. Cale's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly, considering her words. Who would you suggest then? Elira hesitated, though the name had been sitting uneasily in her thoughts since the previous night. Isolde Crane has made her disdain for me quite clear since my arrival. I have heard whispers among the servants that her family has long expected her to be presented as your mate, given their standing among the noble houses. Callan's expression shifted, something like recognition flickering across his features. Lady Crane's family has indeed positioned her carefully over the years, Your Majesty. It would not be unreasonable to suspect her involvement, though we have no direct proof. Then we find proof, Cale said firmly, quietly, and without alerting her to our suspicions. As Callan departed to begin his discreet investigation, Cale turned back to Elira, his expression softening slightly, despite the tension still evident in his shoulders. I am sorry you have been dragged into such danger, simply for existing within reach of my court. You have nothing to apologize for, Elira said. None of this is your doing. Perhaps not directly, Cale said, settling into the chair across from her. But it exists because of the bond we share, or may share. I cannot help but feel responsible for the danger that has followed you since arriving here. Elira studied him for a long moment, noting the genuine guilt weighing on his features. Do you know what my life was like before I arrived at this stronghold? Cale shook his head slowly. 6 years of silence from my own father, following my failed awakening night. 6 years of being seated at the farthest end of every table, spoken to only when absolutely necessary, treated as an embarrassment, simply for existing as I was born to exist. I was mocked daily by wolves I had grown up alongside, wolves who had once called themselves my friends, before my failure to shift made me unworthy of their company. Cale's expression darkened further with every word, though he remained silent, allowing her to continue. The threats I have received since arriving here are frightening, certainly, Elira continued, but they are also, in some strange way, the first time in 6 years that anyone has considered me significant enough to threaten at all. For 6 years, I was simply beneath notice. Now, at least, I am someone worth fearing, even if that fear comes wrapped in danger. That is not the way I wish for you to find your worth, Cale said quietly. Through fear or threat, rather than through genuine recognition of who you are. I know, Elira said, offering him a small, tired smile. But it is difficult to unlearn 22 years of believing myself worthless, simply because a king now sees something different. Cale reached across the space between them, hesitating only briefly, before taking her hand gently in his own. Then allow me to spend however long it takes helping you unlearn it. Elira did not pull away. They sat together in comfortable silence for several long minutes, the warmth of his hand around hers feeling steadier and more real than anything she had experienced in longer than she could remember. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, more vulnerable than she had allowed herself to be with anyone in years. My father sent a letter this morning, she admitted. Wren forwarded it to me, along with a note of her own, warning me of its contents. What does it say? Elira withdrew her hand gently to retrieve the folded parchment from within her sleeve, passing it to Cale without further comment. He read it slowly, his expression growing increasingly cold with every line. The letter, written in Doran Voss's precise, formal handwriting, demanded that Elira return home immediately, citing concerns about the family's reputation, should this supposed bond prove false, as her father clearly expected it would. It spoke of embarrassment, of wasted opportunity, of the shame that would follow House Voss should Elira continue pursuing what he termed a foolish and impossible fantasy. Nowhere within the letter did Doran express concern for Elira's well-being, or curiosity about her happiness, or anything resembling genuine parental affection. "This is disgraceful," Cale said, setting the letter down with visible restraint. "He speaks of you as though you are property to be managed, rather than his own daughter." "That is precisely how he has always seen me," Elira said quietly. "I stopped expecting anything different many years ago." "You deserve better than that," Cale said, his voice fierce with quiet conviction. "You deserve a family who celebrates you, rather than merely tolerates you, let alone one who considers your potential happiness an embarrassment." Elira felt tears threatening once more, and this time, she did not try quite as hard to hold them back. "It is difficult to hear such kindness, after so many years without it." "Then I will simply have to say it more often," Cale said, "until it no longer feels difficult to hear." Something shifted between them in that quiet study, something Elira could not entirely name but felt deeply nonetheless, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the crackling fire nearby. For the first time since her awakening night 6 years ago, she allowed herself to imagine a future in which she was not defined by what she lacked, but by whatever unique and hidden thing might yet emerge from within her. That evening, as she prepared for bed with extra guards now stationed directly outside her door, Elira caught sight of her reflection in the mirror and paused, studying herself carefully for the first time in longer than she could remember. She did not look broken. She did not look empty. She looked, simply, like a young woman standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, waiting to discover exactly what she might become. Somewhere within the stronghold that same night, Isolde Crane received word that Captain Doyle had begun quietly investigating the recent threats against Elira Voss, and her expression, upon hearing this news, curled into something sharp and dangerous. If quiet threats were no longer sufficient to drive the wolfless girl away, Isolde decided, then more drastic measures would simply have to be arranged. The cup slipped from Ren's hand and shattered against the stone floor, the instant she smelled the strange, bitter undertone hidden beneath the sweetness of the tea. "Do not drink that," Ren said sharply, catching Elira's wrist just as she lifted her own cup toward her lips. "Something is wrong with it." Elira set the cup down immediately, her heart lurching, as Ren leaned closer, sniffing carefully at the spilled liquid pooling across the floor. Ren had arrived at the stronghold only 2 days earlier, having finally convinced her grandfather Garin to allow her to accompany House Voss's continued dealings with the king's court, and Elira had never been more grateful for her friend's keen senses. "Fetch the king's personal healer immediately," Ren instructed one of the guards stationed nearby, her voice steady despite the alarm evident in her eyes. "Tell her we require testing on this tea at once." Within the hour, the healer confirmed what Ren had already suspected. The tea had been laced with a rare herb known to cause severe illness in wolves, particularly during the days surrounding a full moon, when the body's natural defenses weakened considerably in preparation for the shift that would never come for someone like Elira, at least not through natural means. "Had you consumed even half this cup," the healer explained grimly, "you would have fallen seriously ill within hours, quite possibly beyond what my skills could have remedied in time." Cale's reaction, upon hearing this news, was colder and more controlled than Elira had yet witnessed, a fury so contained it frightened her more than any outburst might have. "This ends now," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Callan, what have you uncovered thus far?" Callan Doyle stepped forward, his expression grave. "We have traced the tea's preparation to a servant within the kitchen, who has recently taken on considerable debt that was quietly settled just 3 days ago by an anonymous benefactor. We believe, though we cannot yet prove absolutely, that this benefactor is connected to House Crane." "Bring the servant before me," Cale ordered. The servant, a nervous young man named Rowan Fitch, arrived trembling before the king within the hour, and it did not take long for his composure to crumble entirely under Cale's unflinching, patient interrogation. He confessed quickly, desperate for leniency, that he had been approached by a woman he did not know by name, though he described her clothing and bearing in enough detail that Callan confirmed it matched Isolde Crane precisely. She told me only that the tea needed a special ingredient added, to help settle nerves before the gathering season's conclusion, Rowan admitted, his voice shaking. I swear before you, Your Majesty, I did not know it would cause harm. I needed the coin desperately, and she offered more than I had seen in years. Cale's expression remained carefully controlled, though Elira could see the effort it cost him. You will be dealt with according to the laws governing attempted harm within this stronghold, but your honesty today will be considered in that judgment. Once Rowan had been led away, Cale turned to Elira, his expression finally cracking, to reveal the raw fear he had been suppressing throughout the entire ordeal. I nearly lost you today, but you did not, Elira said softly, reaching for his hand without hesitation this time. This cannot continue, Cale said, his voice rough. Isolde Crane will be summoned before the full court, and whatever proof we have gathered will be presented publicly. I will not allow her, or anyone else, to threaten your life, simply because they resent what you might become. True to his word, Isolde Crane was summoned before the assembled court that very evening, her expression carefully composed as she entered the great hall, though Elira noticed the faint tremor in her hands as Callan Doyle laid out the evidence gathered against her. These are baseless accusations, Isolde declared, her voice ringing with practiced indignation. I have no knowledge of this servant, nor any involvement in whatever unfortunate incident has occurred. The servant identified you specifically, Cale said, his voice cold, and even from his seat upon the throne. Your family's finances show a substantial withdrawal 3 days prior to the incident, matching precisely the sum the servant received. Do you continue to deny your involvement? Isolde's composure finally cracked, fury replacing the careful mask she had maintained until that moment. She does not belong here, she spat, gesturing sharply toward Elira, a wolfless girl, elevated above wolves, who have spent their entire lives proving their worth through strength and sacrifice. I was raised from childhood to believe I might one day stand beside you, Your Majesty, and now, you would cast that future aside for a girl who cannot even shift? The hall fell utterly silent, the raw honesty of Isolde's outburst hanging heavy in the air. Whatever expectations you were raised believing, Cale said finally, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the silent hall, they do not grant you the right to threaten another wolf's life. Elira Voss has done nothing to earn your cruelty beyond existing in a manner you did not anticipate. She is nothing, Isolde said bitterly. Nothing but an empty girl playing at significance she does not deserve. That is enough, Cale said, his voice suddenly sharp enough to make several nearby wolves flinch. House Crane will be stripped of its standing within this court for a full year, and Lady Crane herself will be confined to her family's territory, forbidden from stepping foot within this stronghold, until such time as I deem her sufficiently reformed to return. Isolde's face drained of color, the severity of her punishment clearly exceeding anything she had anticipated. She was led from the hall by guards, her furious gaze locking briefly with Elira's before she disappeared through the great doors, and something in that final look sent an uneasy chill down Elira's spine, a promise of unfinished business rather than an ending. That night, Elira found herself unable to sleep, despite the exhaustion weighing heavily upon her. She sat by her window once more, watching the moon climb steadily toward its fullness, only 3 nights away now according to the stronghold's astronomers. The restlessness beneath her skin had grown steadily more intense throughout the past week, a strange pressure building beneath her ribs that she could no longer dismiss as mere imagination. A soft knock sounded at her door, and she opened it to find Cale standing in the corridor, still dressed in the formal attire he had worn during Isolde's judgment, his expression weary but gentle. I could not sleep either, he admitted, and found myself wanting to ensure you were well after everything that occurred today. Elira stepped aside, allowing him into her chamber, and they settled together near the window, watching the moon in comfortable silence for several long minutes. Do you feel it? Cale asked eventually, his voice quiet. The moon growing closer to its fullness? I feel something, Elira admitted, stronger than I have ever felt before, as though something inside me is straining harder against whatever holds it in place, closer to breaking free than it has ever been. Kale turned to study her carefully in the pale moonlight filtering through the window. Lior believes the bond between us has strengthened considerably over these past weeks. Perhaps enough, combined with the coming full moon, to finally break whatever seal has kept your wolf dormant all these years. And if it does not? Elira asked quietly, voicing the fear she had carried since Lior first explained the legend of the sleeping line. What if I remain exactly as I have always been, and all of this, the danger, the hope, the bond we have built, amounts to nothing more than a beautiful mistake? Kale reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his own. Then you will still be exactly the woman I recognized in that hall the moment I first saw you. Whatever sleeps within you, or does not, changes nothing about what I feel for you, Elira. Tears gathered in her eyes at the quiet sincerity of his words, and for the first time since arriving at the stronghold weeks earlier, Elira allowed herself to believe, truly believe, that perhaps she was worthy of love, exactly as she was, wolf or no wolf, legend or ordinary girl. Outside the window, the moon continued its steady climb toward fullness, 3 nights away from whatever truth it might finally reveal, and deep within her chest, that ancient restlessness stirred once more, stronger and more insistent than ever before. Fire erupted along the eastern wall of the stronghold just as the full moon reached its peak, and the entire courtyard dissolved into chaos within seconds. Elira woke to the sound of shouting and the acrid smell of smoke drifting through her window, her heart lurching painfully as she scrambled from her bed toward the source of the commotion. Through the window, she could see armed figures moving swiftly through the courtyard below, their intentions clearly hostile, clashing violently with the king's guards who scrambled to defend the stronghold's walls. "Stay here," Callan Doyle ordered, bursting through her door with his sword already drawn. "This is a coordinated assault. Someone has hired mercenaries to breach the stronghold during tonight's full moon, when defenses are traditionally weakened as guards shift for their own patrols." "Where is Kale?" Elira demanded, fear gripping her chest. "Leading the defense at the main gate," Callan said grimly. "He ordered me specifically to ensure your safety before joining him myself." But Elira could not simply remain hidden while chaos consumed the stronghold around her, not while Kale faced danger at its very center. She slipped past Callan the moment his attention shifted toward securing her window, moving swiftly through the smoke-filled corridors despite his shouted protests behind her. She reached the courtyard just as the fighting intensified, the king's guards holding their ground against a wave of armed intruders whose faces remained obscured beneath dark hoods. Through the chaos, she spotted Kale near the main gate, fighting with the fierce, controlled precision of a man who had trained his entire life for exactly this kind of confrontation, though even he seemed increasingly overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers pressing against his defenses. A figure broke away from the main fighting, moving with deliberate purpose directly toward where Kale stood, a blade gleaming wickedly in the moonlight, aimed squarely at his unguarded back. "Kale!" Elira screamed, the warning tearing from her throat before conscious thought could stop her. He turned just in time to deflect the initial strike, but the attacker pressed forward relentlessly, driving Kale backward toward the stone wall behind him, and Elira watched in horror as a second blade found its mark, slicing across his shoulder deep enough to make him stumble. Something inside Elira shattered in that moment. A wall she had not even known existed, collapsing beneath a surge of pure, primal terror and fury combined. She did not remember deciding to run toward him. She only remembered the world blurring around her, the ground rushing past faster than her legs should have carried her, her vision sharpening with a clarity she had never before experienced, colors and shapes and scents suddenly overwhelming in their intensity. The attacker raised his blade for what would have been a killing strike against Kale's exposed side, and Elira threw herself forward with a desperate cry that tore from somewhere deep and ancient within her chest. Pain exploded through her entire body, unlike anything she had ever felt before, bones shifting and reshaping themselves in an agony so complete it stole the breath from her lungs. She heard herself scream, though the sound emerging from her throat was not entirely human, and through the haze of overwhelming pain, she felt her body changing, transforming, becoming something else entirely. When the transformation finally completed, Elira stood on 4 powerful legs, her body covered in fur the color of moonlight itself, pale silver threaded through with darker streaks, larger and more powerful than any wolf she had ever seen depicted in the ancient texts Lior had shown her. The attacker, who had been moments away from ending Kale's life, stumbled backward in shock, his blade falling uselessly from his grip as he stared at the impossible creature that had appeared between himself and his intended target. Elira did not think. She acted purely on instinct, lunging forward with a speed and power that felt both entirely foreign and somehow deeply, intrinsically her own, driving the attacker backward with a controlled ferocity that left him no opportunity to recover his weapon or his composure. Around the courtyard, the fighting slowed as more and more guards and attackers alike turned to witness the impossible sight of Elira's transformation, her silver form gleaming beneath the full moon's light like something out of the oldest legends any of them had ever heard whispered around campfires. The attackers, clearly unprepared for this development, began retreating in disorganized panic, scrambling back over the stronghold's walls as quickly as they had breached them, leaving behind several of their fallen comrades, and, more importantly, leaving Kale alive, though wounded, and staring at Elira, with an expression of stunned, overwhelming awe. Once the last of the attackers had fled, Elira felt the transformation reverse itself, her body shifting back into human form, with considerably less pain than the initial change, though exhaustion crashed over her so completely that her legs buckled beneath her. Kale caught her before she hit the ground, his uninjured arm wrapping securely around her as he lowered them both carefully to the stone courtyard, his expression a mixture of relief, wonder, and lingering fear for the injury she had prevented him from suffering. "You saved my life," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You would have done the same," Elira managed weakly, exhaustion pulling heavily at her consciousness. "I need you to stay awake," Kale said urgently, cradling her carefully against his chest as guards rushed toward them, shouting for the healer amid the settling chaos of the courtyard. "Elira, please, stay with me." "I am simply tired," she murmured, though the world had begun to blur pleasantly around the edges. "That is all. I promise." The healer arrived within moments, confirming quickly that Elira's exhaustion stemmed from the sheer magnitude of her first transformation, rather than any serious injury, though she recommended immediate rest regardless. Kale carried her personally to her chambers, despite his own wound still bleeding freely beneath his torn sleeve, refusing to relinquish her to anyone else's care until she had been safely settled. As healers tended to his shoulder nearby, Kale remained close beside Elira's bed, watching over her with an intensity that spoke of emotions far deeper than simple gratitude for having his life saved. "You are the sleeping line," he said softly, once the healers had finished their work and departed, leaving them finally alone in the quiet chamber. "Lior's legend was true all along." "I felt it," Elira murmured, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, though sleep had not yet fully claimed her. "The moment I saw that blade coming toward you, something inside me simply broke free. I have never felt anything so powerful in my entire life." "You are remarkable," Kale said, brushing a strand of hair gently away from her face. "You have always been remarkable, long before tonight ever proved it to the rest of this kingdom." Elira managed a small, tired smile before sleep finally claimed her fully, and Kale remained beside her throughout the remainder of the night, watching over her with the fierce, protective devotion of a man who had very nearly lost everything he had only just begun to understand he wanted. Outside her window, the full moon continued its slow descent toward morning, having witnessed, at long last, the awakening of a bloodline, believed lost to legend for centuries, a wolf born not of ordinary inheritance, but of a bond so rare and powerful that it had waited 22 years to finally reveal itself. By morning, word of what had occurred within the stronghold's courtyard had already begun spreading throughout the kingdom, carried by every guard and servant who had witnessed the impossible sight of Elira Voss. The wolfless girl mocked and dismissed her entire life, transforming into a creature of legend to save her king. The great hall had never been so crowded, wolves from every corner of the kingdom pressing shoulder to shoulder within its ancient stone walls, all of them desperate for a glimpse of the woman whose transformation had already become legend within a single day. Elira stood beside Kale upon the raised dais, her nerves stretched thin despite the healers having declared her fully recovered from the previous night's ordeal. She wore a gown of deep silver, chosen specifically, Ren had insisted, to honor the color of the wolf she had become, and though the fabric felt foreign against her skin, she found she no longer wished to shrink from the attention fixed upon her. "Silence," Silas Marrow called, and the hall gradually quieted beneath his authority, hundreds of eyes turning expectantly toward the king and the woman standing beside him. Cale stepped forward, his shoulders still bandaged beneath his formal attire, though his voice carried with its usual unshakable command. 6 weeks ago, Illyra Voss stood before this court, dismissed by many of you, as wolfless, empty, unworthy of consideration. Last night, she revealed herself to be the bearer of the sleeping line, a bloodline believed lost to legend for centuries, and in doing so, she saved my life at considerable risk to her own. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, though none dared interrupt as Cale continued. I stand before you today to declare, without reservation or doubt, that Illyra Voss is my true mate, chosen not by tradition or expectation, but by the deepest recognition my wolf has ever known. Any who continue to mock or threaten her will answer directly to me. His gaze swept deliberately across the crowd, lingering pointedly on the section where House Voss stood assembled, Doran's face pale with the sudden, dawning realization of exactly how thoroughly he had misjudged his own daughter. Furthermore, Cale continued, the investigation into last night's attack has concluded. Isolde Crane, already confined to her family's territory for previous threats against Lady Voss, has been confirmed as the party responsible for hiring the mercenaries who breached this stronghold. She will face the full judgment of this court, and House Crane's standing shall be revoked entirely, its lands and titles reassigned pending my further review. Gasps erupted throughout the hall, though beneath the shock, Illyra noticed a subtle shift in many expressions, something like reassessment as wolves who had once dismissed her, now studied her with newfound, uncertain respect. Doran Voss stepped forward from among the crowd, his expression carefully composed despite the visible strain evident beneath it. Your Majesty, I must express House Voss's deepest apologies for any misunderstanding regarding my daughter's worth. Had you known she carried a legendary bloodline, you would have treated her with respect. Cale interrupted coldly, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. But you did not know, and treated her with cruelty regardless, simply because she did not conform to expectations you had established long before ever truly knowing her as a person. That is a failing you must reckon with yourself, Lord Voss, not one I intend to absolve simply because her worth has now been proven to your satisfaction. Doran's face flushed with a mixture of shame and barely concealed anger, though he said nothing further, retreating back into the crowd without another word. Petra Lang, standing nearby, refused to meet Illyra's eyes at all, her earlier cruelty clearly weighing upon her, now that the wolfless girl she had so often mocked stood revealed as something far rarer than anything Petra herself would ever become. I would also like to acknowledge, Cale continued, his tone softening slightly as his gaze returned to Illyra beside him, that Lady Voss endured years of unwarranted cruelty and dismissal before ever setting foot within this stronghold. That history does not simply disappear because her wolf has now revealed itself. I would ask this court to consider, moving forward, how quickly judgment was passed upon someone who ultimately proved herself more courageous and powerful than nearly any wolf gathered within this hall. A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Illyra felt something loosen slightly in her chest, a tension she had carried for 6 long years beginning, ever so slightly, to ease. After the formal proceedings concluded, Illyra found herself surrounded by wolves, eager to offer congratulations and apologies in equal measure. The same nobles who had once whispered cruelly about her absence of a wolf, now falling over themselves to express admiration for her courage and newfound power. She accepted their words with careful grace, though privately she recognized the hollow nature of respect, earned only through fear and legend, rather than genuine recognition of her character. Ren found her eventually amid the crowd, pulling her aside with a relieved smile. I told you something strange might happen, she said, echoing words spoken weeks earlier, on a cold balcony, that already felt like a lifetime ago. You did, Illyra admitted, laughing despite the exhaustion still lingering beneath her composure. Though I confess I never imagined anything quite this strange. How does it feel? Ren asked. Being recognized, finally, for everything you always were beneath the surface? Illyra considered the question carefully before answering. Strange. Wonderful, in some ways, but also strange, knowing that so many of these same wolves would have continued mocking me indefinitely, had my wolf never awakened at all. I cannot help wondering what my worth would have remained had last night gone differently. Your worth was never in question, Kale said, appearing beside them with a gentleness that belied the commanding authority he had projected only moments earlier, before the assembled court. Not to me, and not to those who genuinely knew you, rather than merely the reputation others constructed around you. Alira turned to him, studying the sincerity evident in his stormy eyes, and felt that same warm certainty settle over her chest that she had first noticed weeks earlier in his private study, when he had first suggested that everything she believed about herself might be entirely wrong. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saying that publicly, before the entire court, for defending me, even before you knew for certain what I truly was." "I did not need certainty to know your worth," Kale replied. "I only needed to see you clearly, which is something far too many wolves in that hall failed to do, until fear and legend finally forced their hand." As evening settled over the stronghold, Alira found herself once again standing beside the tall windows of the private garden, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains in brilliant streaks of orange and gold. Kale joined her there, his bandaged shoulder still visible beneath his loosened collar, and together they watched the day fade into twilight in comfortable, contented silence. "What happens now?" Alira asked eventually, breaking the peaceful quiet between them. "Now," Kale said, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a warmth she had come to treasure deeply over these past weeks. "We begin building whatever future you wish to create, together, free from the judgment and cruelty that defined so much of your life before this moment." Alira smiled, the expression coming easily and genuinely to her face, for what felt like the first time in longer than she could properly remember. "I believe I would like that very much." Somewhere far beyond the stronghold's walls, in a modest cell awaiting formal judgment, Isolde Crane sat in furious, humiliated silence, her carefully constructed ambitions reduced entirely to ruin by a girl she had spent months dismissing as beneath her notice. But within the stronghold itself, beneath a sky slowly filling with stars, Alira Voss stood beside the Alpha King, finally recognized not merely as a legend awakened through danger, but as a woman whose worth had never truly depended upon a wolf at all. A challenge horn sounded across the training grounds, just as dawn broke over the stronghold, sharp and unmistakable, silencing every conversation within earshot instantly. Alira looked up from the sparring session Callan had insisted on beginning weeks earlier, determined to help her learn control over her newly awakened wolf, and found a delegation of unfamiliar wolves standing at the edge of the grounds, their leader stepping forward with obvious purpose. "I am Brennan Cade, Alpha of the Northern Ridge Pack," the stranger announced, his gaze sweeping dismissively over Alira before settling on Kale, who had arrived swiftly upon hearing the challenge horn. "I have come to formally contest the legitimacy of this supposed sleeping line bloodline. Such power has not existed in centuries, and I refuse to accept a mate claim built upon convenient legend rather than proven fact." Kale's expression hardened immediately. "The legitimacy of Lady Voss's bloodline has already been confirmed by Elder Leor Ashwood, alongside dozens of witnesses who observed her transformation directly." "Witnesses can be mistaken," Brennan countered, "or persuaded to support whatever story benefits their king most conveniently. I demand a formal demonstration, before assembled alphas from every territory, proving beyond doubt that this claim is genuine." Alira felt a familiar flicker of the old fear rising within her chest, that instinctive dread of being examined and judged before an audience determined to find her lacking. But this time, standing beside Kale with weeks of growing confidence steadying her spine, the fear did not overwhelm her the way it once might have. "I accept the challenge," she said, before Kale could respond on her behalf, stepping forward to meet Brennan Cade's skeptical gaze directly. Surprise flickered across the Northern Alpha's features, quickly masked beneath renewed skepticism. "Very well. 3 days from now, at the next appropriate gathering of the moon's influence, you will demonstrate your transformation before assembled witnesses from every major territory. Should you fail, House Voss's claim to this legendary bloodline will be formally denounced, and your bond with the Alpha King declared invalid by unanimous council decision." "And should she succeed?" Kale asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Then I will personally kneel before her and acknowledge the truth of what she carries within her blood," Brennan said, "whatever pride that costs me." The following 3 days passed in careful preparation, Leor working closely alongside Alira, to help her understand the delicate balance between control and instinct that governed her newfound wolf. She learned to recognize the subtle signs preceding transformation, the restlessness building steadily beneath her skin, the way her senses sharpened incrementally as the shift approached. "You must not fear it," Lior instructed during one such session, watching carefully as Alira practiced calling upon that internal sensation, without the desperate panic that had triggered her first transformation. "Your wolf awakened through crisis, but it need not remain bound to fear forever. Invite it forward gently, as you might invite an old friend into a familiar room." Slowly, painstakingly, Alira began to understand the truth in his words, learning to coax her wolf forward through calm concentration, rather than desperate necessity, each small success building her confidence steadily toward the formal demonstration awaiting her. Kale remained close throughout those 3 days, offering steady encouragement whenever doubt crept into her thoughts, his presence alone seeming to strengthen whatever bond continued deepening between them with each passing hour. "Do you believe I will succeed?" Alira asked him, the night before the demonstration, the two of them sitting together beneath the same window where they had first discussed the restless sensations that had eventually proven her legendary heritage. "I know you will," Kale said simply, "not because I doubt Brennan Cade's skepticism holds merit, but because I have watched you grow steadily more confident and capable with every single day since your wolf first emerged. You are remarkable, Alira, regardless of whether anyone else chooses to recognize it." The morning of the formal demonstration arrived clear and bright. Alphas from every major territory gathered within the stronghold's largest courtyard, their expressions ranging from open curiosity to Brennan Cade's continued, stubborn skepticism. Alira stood at the center of the assembled crowd, Kale beside her, Lior and Ren watching anxiously from nearby, and drew a slow, steadying breath as she recalled everything Lior had taught her over these past 3 days. She closed her eyes, reaching inward toward that familiar restlessness, now grown comfortable and known rather than frightening, inviting her wolf forward exactly as Lior had instructed, gently, without desperation or fear. The transformation came smoothly this time, considerably less painful than her first desperate shift, her body reshaping itself with practiced grace into the same magnificent silver form that had saved Kale's life weeks earlier. Gasps rippled through the assembled crowd as she stood revealed before them, powerful and undeniable, every doubt regarding the legitimacy of her bloodline crumbling instantly beneath the plain evidence standing before their eyes. Brennan Cade stared for a long moment, his skepticism visibly warring with the undeniable proof before him, before finally, slowly, he knelt exactly as he had promised, his head bowed in genuine acknowledgement. "The sleeping line lives," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "I withdraw my challenge and acknowledge Alira Voss as the Alpha King's rightful mate, bearer of a bloodline I believed lost to legend." One by one, the assembled Alphas followed his example, kneeling in acknowledgement of what they had witnessed, and Alira, once she had shifted back into human form, found herself surrounded by respect and recognition she had never once imagined possible during her long years of quiet suffering within House Voss. The formal ceremony declaring Alira as Kale's mate and future queen took place 3 weeks later, the great hall transformed, with garlands of silver and blue. Wolves from every territory gathered to witness what many now considered the beginning of a new era for the kingdom. Alira stood before the assembled court in a gown that echoed the silver of her wolf's fur, Kale beside her in formal attire befitting the occasion. And as the ceremonial vows were exchanged, she felt none of the old fear or shame that had once defined so much of her existence. Doran Voss attended the ceremony, standing stiffly among the crowd, though he made no attempt to approach his daughter directly, the distance between them clearly too vast to bridge with a single ceremony, regardless of the recognition she had since earned. Alira found she no longer needed his approval the way she once had, having discovered her own worth through weeks of growth and challenge that owed nothing to her father's grudging acceptance. Ren stood proudly among the witnesses, tears of genuine joy tracking down her face as she watched her closest friend transform from the quiet, dismissed girl she had comforted on countless lonely nights into the confident, radiant woman standing beside the kingdom's most powerful alpha. As the ceremony concluded and celebration erupted throughout the stronghold, Kale drew Alira aside briefly, finding a quiet moment amid the festivities within the same private garden where so much of their bond had first developed. "You have come so far," he said softly, studying her with evident pride and affection. From the girl who stood trembling in that hall months ago, certain she would be mocked and dismissed, into the woman standing here today, recognized throughout the entire kingdom for her courage and her power. "I could not have found this version of myself without you," Alira admitted. "Without your patience, your belief in me, even before either of us understood exactly what I carried within myself." "You always carried it," Kale said gently. "I simply had the privilege of witnessing it awaken." They stood together beneath the same stars that had witnessed her first tentative hope weeks earlier, and Alira found herself marveling at how completely her life had transformed since that first humiliating evening in House Voss's great hall, when broken glass had scattered across the floor at her feet and laughter had followed her every step. She was no longer the wolfless girl, mocked and dismissed by those who claimed to know her worth. She was Alira Voss, bearer of the sleeping line, chosen mate of the Alpha King, and queen of a kingdom that had finally learned to see her clearly for exactly who she had always been. The moon rose full and radiant above the stronghold that night, bathing the celebrating kingdom in silver light, and somewhere within the quiet garden, Alira allowed herself, at long last, to simply be happy, without fear, without doubt, and without a single trace of the shame that had once defined her entire existence. Her story, she realized, watching Kale's warm smile in the moonlight, was only just beginning.